the implications of illusionism on the distribution of consciousness. Due to the length of the talk, I can only say a bit, and some technical vocabulary will be unexplained. But this is everything I can do. So feel free to ask me anything later or during the conference. Well, I will first start with a characterization of illusionism. I think that we can divide illusionism between two camps: a strong illusionism and weak illusionism. Strong illusionism is very easy to say, which is phenomenal consciousness. The thing that we call phenomenal consciousness does not exist at all. It is a technical term which lacks a referent. On the other hand, we have weak illusionism. The idea of weak illusionism is that phenomenal consciousness does exist, but it lacks the properties generally ascribed to it, like being intrinsic, ineffable, non-functional. There are two interesting implications of this classification, because I think that this is merely a verbal dispute. There are two ways to put the same idea, which is that consciousness is a wholly physical process, functional, and there's not a further inference to some inner private phenomena. The other important consequence is a lot of physicalistic theories of mind, I would say, that are in reality weak illusionistic. So this turns illusionism in a theory which, although seen as very unpopular, if we count also a lot of weak illusionists, then it's a much more popular theory. I will talk about the implications of illusionism when we are asking which beings are conscious. I think that those are not necessary entailments, but very natural components and very plausible entailments of illusionism about consciousness, which are pluralism and deep gradualism. The idea of pluralism is that there's not a single kind that we can identify with phenomenal consciousness altogether. So this is very radical in the sense that there is not a single phenomenon that we can call consciousness impliciter and be content with that. Instead, there are different processes that, for example, in humans are all present, but if you catch some phenomena or some others, you can add phenomena, and those clusters of functional processes are what we call consciousness. But there is not a single process, whatever complex it is, that we can parse in a single natural kind. The result is that when we are approaching the topic of sentience or consciousness, we need to build what I call a multidimensional spectrum. Instead of talking about any beings in a single line of less conscious, more conscious, we should talk about the different functions that can be present or absent in different beings and plot them in different graphs. So this is what we would have under a illusionistic view of consciousness. And the other consequence is what Birch calls deep gradualism. The idea that consciousness is gradual seems to be somewhat common sense, but what actually is common sense is shallow gradualism. The properties of consciousness, such as balance or having some presence, or properties having some properties or others, having less properties or more properties, is kind of common sense. What is not common sense is the fact that being conscious at all is gradual. You can have heavily borderline cases of consciousness where there is not a fact of the matter whether that being is conscious. This makes the possibility of having genuine borderline cases, like, for example, the example of borderline case is baldness. You cannot say exactly how many hairs does it take to be bald, so that would be a problem. This has very interesting consequences, because it makes the problem of consciousness much more tractable in an empirical sense. A lot of studies on consciousness are aiming to have a set of functional criteria to make an inference to an internal, unobservable in principle phenomena, which is this private qualia. Illusionism says that this kind of private qualia do not exist at all. So So this makes it more empirical tractable, as you only have to make this multi-spectrum graph of all the kinds of functions that a being has. That will be the end of the story under illusionism. What is more complicated are the ethical consequences. If you have under phenomenal realism, you can pretty easily ground moral value in phenomenal consciousness. But under illusionism, we can still ground value on consciousness. But the problem is that the picture of consciousness is much more complicated, as we do not have either or an on-off switch, but rather a complete spectrum with many dimensions and with truly borderline cases, which is very problematic, because then you could say that you have a borderline case of having moral worth, for example. So yeah, I think that that's a pretty although I think that what's interesting about illusionism is that it's true. I think that those last consequences are very important because it makes it more empirically tractable, but much more hard to clarify ethically. And I would leave it here for some questions.
I'm a bit unsure regarding the statement that you made about strong and weak illusionism being effectively the same. Like for example, strong illusionism isn't compatible with effective realism or poetic naturalism as theories like metaphysical theories. So is it more fair to say, like, I feel like the whole discussion was more applicable to weak illusionism, because if you actually don't think that phenomenal consciousness exists, then it does make the ethical debate a bit hand-wavy, I guess, and arbitrary, but all of the other questions don't really apply.
I don't think I agree, because first of all the discussion was heavily inspired by Keith Frankis, who is a strong illusionist, and I think that one of the things that makes, in my opinion, merely verbal dispute is the fact that when you start parsing when you start reading different philosophers who say they are not illusionists, but they are qualia realists or something like that, you see that the different compromises are very similar. There's not much of a bigger difference. For example, Pepino, who is very famously a type B materialist, which is not an illusionist, in his last works talks about what I'm talking about, not being a single kind, being deeply globalistic, etc. And other example, for example, is later Carruthers, not the first Carruthers about the hot theory of consciousness, but the later Carruthers. Yeah, I think that what we need to do when talking about these topics is clarify the properties that we are ascribing to consciousness, because phenomenality is sometimes not a property of consciousness that it has, it's merely a label of some kind of consciousness. So if two philosophers agree completely on the properties that they are ascribing to consciousness, but one says that, well, this is phenomenal consciousness, but it lacks the properties that qualia realis apply to it. And other people say, well, this is consciousness impliciter, and phenomenal I do not use phenomenal because it has harmful connotations. Then it is not really a disagreement.